very much. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be included in your program and to help kick things off on this first day. So as you heard from Soledad, I've spent a fair amount of time investigating and writing about online manipulation, disinformation of our digital environment. And so I want to talk today a little bit about really the last decade or so of this. And how this has intersected certainly with politics, but also, the challenges we have of really documenting and investigating all of the different ways that our media environment is being manipulated. This is become a really urgent thing for newsrooms to be able to do, but also for a wide variety of researchers across different disciplines and certainly around the world. And on that note, I do want to say, I'm a journalist. I speak and work in English. I'm based in Canada. I work for an American outlet. And so, of course, I have certain biases in my work where I've been, prioritizing work, looking more at the US and Canada than other places. And so I do have some examples from other parts of the world, but, I will acknowledge that, I'm sure you're aware of some in some of your countries that perhaps I'm not going to be talking with now. But hopefully you'll see some commonality between the things that I talk about and some of the things that you may see in your countries. And as you heard off the top, I'm very eager to take your questions and to dive into that. So let me begin by sharing my screen. I'll bring up some slides. And I also want to thank the interpreters in advance because I do tend to speak a little bit quickly, and hopefully I will be able to regulate myself and slow down a little bit so that you're able to keep up and everyone can also hear what's going on. Again, it's a pleasure to be invited to present. Here are sort of, the three things that I'm going to go through today. The first, as I mentioned, is looking back over the last roughly 10 years. In the world of online disinformation through the lens of how it has been investigated. Looking at primarily how journalists have been doing this, but I think there's a lot of connection between when journalism and media started paying attention to this topic and also when academics also started paying attention to this topic. Because I can remember a decade ago, there were a very few number of journalists interested in this, and it seemed like I knew the small number of academics, again, those primarily who were publishing in English, who were interested in this. And today, we have a massive amount of journalists and researchers working on it. So the last decade, take us into today, and then I want to talk about some of the trends and challenges that I'm seeing in this. And this is going to affect political discourse in many different countries. And one of the things that you're going to see is that not a surprise is that the internet has enabled people based in one country to be able to target people in another country, and so we do need a unified approach. News organizations, researchers, NGOs, governments need to think about more than just what's happening within their own borders and their own beat areas. So this first phase here for me is roughly about 2011. 2012 to 2016. This is when things were happening, but they had a very small amount of attention, a very small amount of focus. And looking back on it, you can see kind of the seeds being planted for the explosion that we experienced after this period. But of course, not so many people or governments were paying attention at this time. And for me, one of the examples that comes to mind, again, for more the sort of North American audience, was in 2012 with Hurricane Sandy. So this was a big hurricane. It hit the East Coast of the US. It hit New York very hard. And so when you hit a major media center like New York, of course, people in journalism tend to pay a lot of attention to it. And this was, again, relatively early in kind of the history of social media, where social media had a lot of scale and a lot of people were using it. And what we saw when Hurricane Sandy hit New Jersey and New York was a tremendous amount of false and misleading information being spread on Twitter and to a certain extent, some other platforms. And so we saw, this Tumblr blog being run by a journalist actually based in the United Kingdom, kind of trying to track and debunk false claims about Hurricane Sandy. We saw a prestigious American magazine, The Atlantic, doing the similar kind of thing, sorting the real sandy content, from the fakes. And so this was an early experiment in realizing that, oh, in a moment of urgency and emergency, we see a huge outpouring of false and misleading information. And it's not necessarily that everybody is trying to fool everyone. It's that people are scared. They're looking for information. There is a gap of good quality information. And so in that moment, the things that seem shocking or dangerous, they tend to believe and gravitate towards. And so this was an early experiment in kind of trying to mediate this and to step in and say, okay, we're trusted media, we're trusted journalists, we can help you navigate this mass of false and misleading information that's spreading. And I think 2012 was also significant because it was the year when the Brown Moses blog launched. So this was a blog run by the person we now know as Elliot Higgins, who is based in the United Kingdom. But at that point, he was kind of an unemployed guy at home with his family, and he just became obsessed with videos coming out of the conflict in Syria. And he started just using his observation skills and internet research skills to start identifying the types of weapons being used in Syria, particularly the types of weapons being used by the Syrian government and also by the Russian government that stepped in to support them when there was the uprising in Syria. And so we had a guy with no formal training in journalism or investigations who, within a matter of months, really became one of a recognized expert in the munitions and weapons being used in the Syrian conflict. And he was doing this just by watching YouTube videos that activists and other people, and sometimes Syrian government people, were uploading to YouTube. And this was an early form of what we now often refer to as open source investigation, using the material on social media to try and understand what's going on and dig in deeper. One of my favorite pieces of investigation from this early time, this is 2014, is by a data scientist. So he noticed that you can buy fake followers on Twitter, and he decided to buy a bunch of fake followers on Twitter. And he paid $5 for 4,000 Twitter followers. I can tell you the price has gone up since then. It'll cost more than that now. And when the followers started appearing on his account, he tracked them, and he was able to see the other people that these followers were actually, these Twitter accounts were following, and start to understand the network of other people who may have also paid to have more followers, to seem more influential on Twitter. And this was an early example of seeing how easily the signs of influence and trust can be manipulated, and how there was an economy and a profit motive around enabling people to manipulate this environment. And of course, then in 2014, I think one of the significant things that happened first was Russia invaded and annexed Crimea. And so we had a war in Ukraine, and we had early examples of the Russian approach to online disinformation begin. I feel like the war in Ukraine was really a big test bed for Russian disinformation efforts, which are now being echoed by other governments and entities around the world. And that summer, the Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 was shot down over eastern Ukraine. And this created a huge international outcry, of course, but it also, for people like Elliot Higgins, who had been running the Brown Moses blog and was at that time running a new organization called Bellingcat, it created an opportunity for deep investigation, because as soon as the plane went down, Russia was accusing Ukrainian forces of having shot it down Ukraine, and pretty soon the US and others were accusing Russia or Russian-linked separatists from having shot it down. And an information war basically followed this within the theater of the existing war in eastern Ukraine. And so, we can see, for example, this tweet from Elliot. At one point, Russian military people gave a presentation talking about evidence, saying, no, it wasn't, we can see that, here's the position of the Malaysian Airlines flight. We can see that it must have been shot down by someone on the Ukraine side of the conflict. The problem in this case is they basically just grabbed a piece of footage from a random YouTube video. It was clearly not the Malaysian Airlines flight, and it was easily debunked by Elliot and others, showing that here's, the Russian government lying about, this being the Malaysian Airlines flight. And in the bottom graphic there, you can see an infographic produced by an EU anti-disinformation effort, where they show from 2014, from July when the plane is shot down all through to the end of the year, the different explanations that pro-Kremlin media were giving for what really happened to the plane, obscuring the fact that it was a Russian-built missile that was brought into Russian-controlled territory in Ukraine that actually shot it down. And at this point, we know this because of audio recordings, actually, of Russian officers and fighters in eastern Ukraine who were actually talking about what happened. In addition to work by Bellingcat and others who actually tracked the path of this mobile missile unit, which was basically a big vehicle, all the way through, Crimea to the place where it was used to shoot down the plane. And this was done in air, I should note as well. They thought it was a Ukrainian military flight. Instead, they shot down a civilian flight. And so 2014 to me is a really key time because of this battle and because of the techniques used, particularly by Russia at this time. But we also see it as an important time for kind of the emerging field of study and investigation of disinformation. So of course, for those of us in the English speaking world, Snopes is a very well-known site that has been tracking online rumors and urban legends and kind of debunking them and writing about them for a long time. So Snopes was there long before 2014. But in 2014, we start to see other efforts in English language media and other language media as well. So in Ukraine, an organization started called stopfake.org, specifically because of the conflict in Ukraine, specifically because of the political and military disinformation that was coming from pro-Kremlin media within parts of Ukraine, but also from outside Ukraine, targeting people there. And so people at a journalism school in Ukraine started this, and StopFake still exists to this day. The Washington Post started doing kind of a weekly column called "What Was Fake on the Internet This Week?" Suddenly there was this growing awareness that we were starting to become a little bit awash in false and misleading information, and that it was also generating significant attention because things were going viral and getting a lot of traction. And this is sort of, 2014 was also significant for me because I launched a research project called Emergent. The website was emergent.info. It's still online, though it hasn't been updated since 2015, where I wanted to study how claims, unverified claims, were spread and reported on by media. And so we started collecting data. We would identify a claim, a rumor spreading online, maybe on Twitter, on Facebook, on websites. We would track all of the, the websites that wrote about it, and then we would watch over time to see if it turned out to be true or false. And so we evaluated, hundreds of different rumors during a period of 2014, and I could see how the false claims and the ones that turned out to not be true got tremendous amounts of attention, particularly false claims related to politics or big events were getting massive amounts of attention on Facebook and spreading wildly. But when Snopes or the Washington Post or others came in to debunk it, they got very little amounts of attention. It did not spread as far. It did not spread as fast. And so we had an imbalance. And I think this is something we all see and know today. And I think it's true across countries that the more outrageous, false claim, the more insightful content, the more extreme content or remarkable claim, those things get way more attention than, the debunking of it, than the sort of more measured and reasoned response or well-argued article. And this is a dynamic that plays out in our information environments all the time, still to this day. And so I don't usually like to quote myself, but, in this case, it's quite relevant. So from that project Emergent, I published a research paper in 2015 with Columbia University, where I had kind of analyzed these new efforts at debunking and analyzing misinformation and disinformation. And what I found that, these were very spread out. They were inconsistent across different types of media. And the research that we had at that point, which was very early about effective methods of fact checking, about how people, how you can actually affect someone's point of view on a topic by, correcting false information. We had a little bit of research then, not a lot, but it wasn't really being applied in how journalists were doing this work. And so what I also found was that a lot of news websites, and this is still true today, and I think again in different languages, that news media were often a part of the problem of online mis and disinformation rather than a solution. They were often the ones spreading that early shocking claim because they knew it would get a lot of attention on their website or a lot of attention on Facebook. And I think what we've seen, over particularly since 2016 is efforts to try and change that dynamic, efforts by the platforms, efforts by journalists, efforts by other actors as well. And I think we still have a lot of work to do. So that takes us to kind of this next phase here, which is 2016 to 2020. So this I sort of call the Great Awakening period, where suddenly the awareness of these issues becomes much more broad. And we have moments, not just in the United States with Trump, which is like the obvious thing, but other parts of the world as well, where people start to wake up to this and we start to see the pushback. But I think the interesting thing is, as much as we see the effort to stop this stuff and control it increase, we've also seen it really infect politics even more, I would argue. So what are those key things in 2016 that I would point to? Well, one is relatively early in 2016, the Philippines had their sort of national elections, and Duterte, his supporters, his people, they really weaponized Facebook. They had tons of fake accounts that were being used to spread false claims about his opponents. There were tons of people creating Facebook groups where a lot of these false claims would be kind of spread among his most passionate real supporters. So they would act as kind of the dissemination machine to push that out there. And so it was a case where, he lied about a lot of things. He made a lot of very shocking claims, and that rewarded him with a lot of attention on social media. And also the manipulation, particularly of Facebook. In the Philippines, Facebook is extremely widely used. So if you are big on Facebook, you are big everywhere in the Philippines. The exploitation and weaponization of Facebook was a core part of his campaign, and it was successful. We also saw in the United Kingdom, we saw the Brexit vote, which also saw a fair amount of attempts to manipulate the digital environment, a lot of attempts to kind of just sort of lie through any kind of fact checking or efforts to correct the record. And again, the Brexit side, which did have, false and misleading claims. I mean, in this example, they've got, a sign on a truck that was driving around where, they're suggesting that, that you have illegal immigrants, that they would often sort of term in that way, that are sort of flowing into the UK at a huge rate because of the EU. And, the photo is not of immigrants and refugees trying to get into the UK. It's from another part of the world. And then, of course, there is Donald Trump. I'm, as I said on the top, I'm not an American, but I do a lot of coverage of the United States. And so, Trump had the same kind of model as Duterte. He would lie and be shocking, and he was rewarded with tremendous amounts of attention. He exploited the political environment to use a lot of false and misleading stuff, and there was a huge amount of false and misleading information going extremely viral on Facebook, which was a lot of the work that I did that particular year. And I think these three things caused a sort of global awareness. But the truth is that a lot of it, for the platforms like Facebook and others, was all about the US, because that's where they're based. And that's where, if suddenly they're getting criticized in the US, one of their most valuable and important markets, and their home market where legislation can happen, that's when they really start to care. And I think I would just note that, that's still the dynamic. Facebook and other platforms, they spend the most time and attention looking at the United States, looking at Western Europe, looking at places where they are earning the most money, where they are concerned about legislation and regulation, and smaller countries, I would say certainly in Central and South America, parts of Asia, parts of Africa, do not get the same scrutiny, do not get the same oversight, do not get the same service from these platforms. And so the political dynamics in those countries, I think politicians can get away with a lot more, even more than you can in some other parts of the world. Now, I mean, this is, a sort of crude graph here, but it's just showing the interest in the term fake news over time. And this is sort of in line with the US election. Basically, you get to the end of 2016 and it spikes, and we've sort of seen it continue ever since then. And what's interesting to me, and I'll dive into this a little bit more in a second, is that if we kind of look at that interest graph and then we look at the growth in fact-checking groups, according to research from Duke University, they're not exactly the same, but because fact-checking groups existed before, whereas a discussion around quote unquote fake news really was at an almost zero level prior to 2016. But we do see huge growth in the number of fact-checking groups post 2016. In 2016, there were less than 100. By the time this chart goes to 2018, that had more than doubled. And today, that number has almost doubled again in the ensuing 2 or 3 years. And so what we have seen is the explosion in awareness, the explosion in concern, and the explosion in attempts to actually deal with this in a journalistic sense and also in terms of research. So looking at those fact checkers a little bit more, this again is the data from the Duke Reporters Lab. So their report from roughly a year ago found that there are now more than 300 fact-checking organizations around the world. And I find that an encouraging thing. I find it really encouraging when I look at this map and we look at the global South and we look at places other than North America and Western Europe, that a lot of the growth has been happening in those places. We look at India, there's been tremendous growth in the number of fact-checking organizations there, which is good because we're talking about a massive population and also, again, an information environment that is being weaponized in terms of politics. And so I think this is an encouraging sign. And this is what's happening during this period of awakening from 2016 onwards is the response. Facebook in late 2016 announced that it was going to start funding these independent third-party fact checkers. It said, we don't want to be judging the content on our platform. We want some experts to help us with that. And so one of the main reasons for this growth is that Facebook is now the single largest funder of fact checkers in the world, which on one hand, I think is good because yes, we do need more people doing this work, but I think it creates a huge number of conflicts and concerns, which I'll dive into a little bit more. But the reality is that having any single funder being the biggest one is probably a concern. And it's a concern if Facebook at some point decides to change strategy, who's going to fund these fact checkers. And it's a concern because these fact checkers have to work with Facebook at the same time that Facebook is the platform in so many of these countries and parts of the world where a lot of this stuff is being spread at a high rate. It is a strange and conflicted relationship, and it is one that is extremely important to the world of fact checking. And I think we need to be scrutinizing it. So in addition to that form of fact checking, which is often dealing with viral claims, it's often moving very quickly to try and identify and debunk things. In particular, that's what Facebook is paying them to do. Look at the most fast spreading and viral claims on Facebook and fact check them so that it can be slowed down if it's not true. In addition to that kind of quick work, we've also seen the emergence of really deep, thorough digital investigative work. And so like Bellingcat is an organization I've mentioned before. That's what Elliot Higgins went from running his own blog under a pseudonym to helping create Bellingcat, which has done tremendous work investigating disinformation and manipulation from around the world. The New York Times has a tremendous visual investigations team who do, reconstruction of videos and scenes, whether it's shootings or bombings, on the border of Israel and Gaza or what have you, or in the United States or in other parts of the world. In fact, they recently in Afghanistan, the United States military claimed that they had used a drone to shoot a missile and blow up what would have been a suicide bomber heading to the airport in Kabul during the sort of evacuation of American military there. And the New York Times showed that the military was wrong, that they in fact killed an aid worker who was driving a truck filled with water and also with children in it. And this is the kind of deep investigative work using these digital methodologies that I think we can all aspire to. And a couple other examples there. One in the bottom right, revealing one of the key financial key figures behind the QAnon conspiracy theory. Who is behind the lies, who is spreading stuff, who is behind the campaigns. These are things that we as journalists should be doing. But, one of the weird things that's also happened is there's been this emergence of a for-profit industry. So this is by no means a universal list here, but since 2016, there have been a huge number of companies founded, for-profit companies, who say that, using technology or using these digital investigative methods, they can help you fight disinformation. They can detect it, they can stop it, they can alert it. And honestly, this is such a kind of emerging field that I think a lot of these companies will probably end up going out of business, because I don't know how much money there is to be spent on this work. But also, there are cases where these companies, in order to get attention for the work they do, will put out reports. And those reports will make certain claims. And if you actually scrutinize them, they don't stand up. And so we have, this blossoming world of fact checking. We have a blossoming world of academic research all around, political disinformation and other types. And then we also have this blossoming industry here where people are trying to make money doing this work. And, some of them do good work and some of them really don't. And I think it's been really hard for a lot of countries and politicians and other people to distinguish. And it's very hard for the public to distinguish. And so we're sort of ending up with this, what I'm going to call the sort of barbell theory of disinformation. So here's the image of the barbell here, where, on the one side, we have a lot of fact checkers around the world doing quick fact checks and debunkings, trying to meet the viral spread of political disinformation and other types with their own fast work, which I think is needed in our environment. And then at the other end, we have these deep dive investigations that, from the New York Times, from Bellingcat, and from others, where they spend a lot of time. They used often, advanced investigative techniques borrowed from the world of cybersecurity and other places to really reveal important truths. And then, the danger to me is kind of in the middle, where, and so here's an example. This came out a little while ago. This was a report from, again, one of these kind of consulting firms that says it does research in this area. And they claimed that they could show that a lot of content around the QAnon conspiracy, around the January 6th attack on the US Capitol, they had said that they traced it back to Chinese and Russian sources. And so this report that they published was suggesting that, as there was an attack on the seat of democracy in the United States, China and Russia were trying to kind of push it on and egg it on. Now, I mean, that's possible and potentially believable, but it's always a question of the proof. And in this case, it didn't have the proof, but it got written up by so many large media organizations. It got so much attention that a lot of people would read this and think that it's true. But when the researchers and journalists who work in this area and understand how rigorous we need to be looked at it, they saw that the attribution to China and Russia was extremely, extremely unimpressive and could be false. They used some automated technology from one of these companies to determine whether these English language posts had actually been written by Chinese or Russian speakers or actors. And this is technology that has really never been independently tested. So right there, you can't really have confidence in it. And they actually used a very small sample size of posts about QAnon. And they made a big claim that a lot of these posts about QAnon related to in advance of January 6th originated in China and Russia, but they looked at so few of them that they really couldn't make any kind of claim about that. And yet it got written up like it's true, like it's factual. And so we see this, and the risk is you have a lot of people in media who don't do a lot of this work, this type of investigation, and it's easy for them to read something that seems credible and to write it up. And so we have to be, I think, as journalists, very careful of this. And I also think that researchers need to be willing to speak up when they see work that is not rigorous and that does not stand up to scrutiny, because it undermines the entire field and it undermines the work that everyone is trying to do here. Okay, so to summarize where I think we are now, and then I want to talk about a few trends of note before taking your questions. Is, we see these large networks of fact checkers and disinformation reporters. There's beat reporters now, but the skills and knowledge of this kind of work, it's still in a relatively small number of people, and within newsrooms, very few people are being trained on how to do this stuff. We need to scale that up if we're going to make journalists do responsible work. The platforms, as I said, like Facebook and now others like TikTok, are actually starting to pay fact checkers. They are funding them, and this creates, of course, potential conflicts and a sense of dependence on these platforms. And one of the concerns I have is that oftentimes the fact checkers are paid by the number of fact checks they do. There is an incentive to do as many as you can. And if you are constantly trying to find stuff to debunk, you have to move very quickly, which can cause errors, but also maybe you're going to debunk things that nobody's actually really been paying attention to. And you risk making more people aware of the false claim in the act of trying to actually debunk it and say that it's not true. The third point here, which I think is probably deeply felt, and you are more knowledgeable about this than I am, is that there is absolutely global inequality in terms of the resources, the training, and the support being given to researchers, journalists, governments, and others trying to study this problem and counteract online disinformation, and particularly in the field of politics. There is a lot of emphasis on the US and Western Europe in terms of the funding, in terms of what the platforms are doing. And so we end up with, this sense of inequality. We have the haves, big news organizations in US and Western Europe with lots of resources, lots of tools, lots of support and training. And also oftentimes access to data, which of course we all need to do this work. And then you have the have-nots where they can't get support or any kind of response from the platforms. They're not getting as much training. And in terms of access to data, when the platforms release it, they tend to be releasing it to academics in those kind of, wealthier and better resource places. As I mentioned, I'm concerned about the for-profit world in this, but I'm highlighting a couple of tools here. InVid, We Verify, which is a great Chrome extension, and then also Hoaxy. And these are free tools which you should look into and use. And then, last one is there are these low-quality, quote-unquote, investigations which get spread, and they're given credibility when media pick them up and don't scrutinize them. And so, there's a lot of good and a lot of progress that has been made, but there are also some new challenges that come from that progress, is kind of the way I see where we are right now. And the other piece of this, as I mentioned off the top, is that if we look at all of the new funding and the work, the good stuff that's been happening, the fact is that we still have huge challenges. And now that we are really trying to defeat the problem, I think we see how big it truly is. So let's check in on our kind of 2016 people. So Duterte, they had some midterm elections in 2020, and Duterte, was the one. It was his party and his supporters who were really manipulating Facebook, spreading false stuff, and paying firms to kind of pump up him and his candidates back in 2016. Well, we get to 2020. And the opposition figures back in 2016 who said that this was terrible and criticized Duterte and his supporters for this, well, some of them realized, they said, in order for us to compete, we now have to do some of these tactics. And maybe they didn't go as extreme with the false and claims and harassment as Duterte and his supporters did, but they started to hire the same kind of firms to use fake accounts to support their content. And so they felt like, well, we have to do this. We have to join in doing this. Otherwise, we're going to get defeated. So arguably the problem in the Philippines has gotten worse since 2016 because more parties are actually doing this stuff. This is a recent report from the Associated Press where, obviously during COVID-19, we've seen a huge amount of disinformation. And in this case, I think this was good quality work where, they see that basically, as the US at one point, was making a lot of claims and blaming China a lot. Obviously, the virus did originate in China, but, blaming China a lot for things. And at a certain point, China decided to respond and start spreading the completely unsupported and false claim that the virus probably originated in the US. and maybe from US military. And so, rather than us trying to rein in disinformation, I think it's kind of gotten worse with COVID-19, where you had the Chinese government, the Russian government, and the Iranian government all deciding, yeah, this is a good narrative. Let's all say that the virus could have originated in the US. And so in terms of political disinformation, we have absolutely, clear state actors who are engaging in the spread of disinformation because they see it as central to their interests. So I think it is embedded in a lot of the global political discourse, which is a really concerning thing. Of course, if we look at our friend Donald Trump in the United States, he continues to lie about the fact that he lost the most recent election. And so he has in no way been reined in. He has in no way started to move away from his tactic of just lying and saying things that are not true. He has completely maintained the strategy and is fully committed to it. And then, in other parts of the world, we sort of see the same thing. I did a story again last year where Facebook finally removed a bunch of false accounts related to the ruling party in Azerbaijan, who had been harassing independent media, harassing opposition parties. And, an internal Facebook employee had told people about this. And it took the company a year once we published this information. Only after we published this information did they finally remove it. And so, again, it's an example of companies like Facebook not giving equal resources and caring about this in countries around the world in the same way. Same thing was going on in Honduras, and Facebook was extremely slow to take that stuff down. And of course, it's not just on Facebook. On YouTube, you have, the president of Brazil, who has been spreading a lot of misinformation. So, unfortunately, in the politics and disinformation, I think, the lesson for some politicians of 2016 is disinformation is a good strategy. And you should just lie. And if fact checkers tell you you're lying, you just keep going. So that is, one of the big concerns that I see and we have. So quickly, I want to end with just a few of the trends that I see that I think we should be aware of. They relate to politics, but other areas as well. One is disinformation. We see the for-profit people trying to detect and stop it. There are a lot of people who take money to create it. We did a study looking at times where Facebook and other platforms had said, we took down these fake accounts, they belonged and they were operated by a marketing or a PR firm in this country. And what we see is that in 2019, there were way more cases where Facebook, Google, others were saying that paid PR firms were abusing their platform, not always spreading false information, but often, trying to manipulate what's going on. And so clearly the platforms are paying more attention, which I think is one reason why the number goes up. But also, I think there is a real opportunity to be paid to run troll accounts, to be paid to spread false and misleading information. And one example is there was a company called Archimedes Group based in Israel. They worked for clients around the world, and they did this work. They had fake accounts, they had pages, and they described themselves as a political marketing firm. Here's one thing they did in Nigeria. They had a page that was supporting a candidate, and they had a page that was also going against the same candidate. And so, why would you do that? Well, let's say your job is to help elect the candidate. If you run a page that's against them, you can learn about the people who don't support them. And potentially you can manipulate that audience over time. So playing both sides is something that I think we see in politics, where you're going to look and you're going to see the supporters, but you can't assume the supporters or the people against a particular party or candidate are necessarily always going to be authentic. People can play both sides. This is a quite relevant one. Facebook announced one of its first actions against an American marketing firm, CLS Strategies, based in Washington. They had been working, and I think to this day, we don't know who their clients were. They had been running Facebook accounts and pages and Instagram accounts, and they were targeting people in Bolivia, Venezuela, and Mexico. And they spent more than $3.5 million on ads. And you see a couple of the samples of content there, and where they were trying to influence political debate and political discussion. So an American, Washington-based firm paid by unknown people trying to manipulate voters and people in Bolivia, Venezuela, and Mexico. This is something that's happening. And this is one that I worked on. So there's a Colombian businessman named Alex Saab who is currently being detained in Cape Verde, Africa. The US wants him extradited. They say he's been involved in money laundering and that he works with the Maduro government in Venezuela. And so he is fighting his extradition. And working with the Digital Africa Research Lab, we saw that a lot of influencer accounts on Twitter in Nigeria were tweeting in support of Alex Saab and saying, the West African courts need to, refuse to allow him to be extradited. And these are, accounts of, in some cases, very big accounts in Nigeria. And it was strange. Why all of a sudden would influencers in Nigeria care about Alex Saab and care about this case? And why are so many of them citing and tagging, they have the same hashtag, but also they cite the same Twitter accounts? Like, this is strange behavior. And in some cases, we saw very big accounts offering people money if they would engage with their Alex Saab posts, which is obviously very suspicious behavior. So they would tweet this, people would engage with their posts, and then they would delete these offers of payment. The Digital Africa Research Lab captured these. And so what was going on, we were able to find the contract that influencers were paid. They were paid to tweet in support of him. They were paid to tag certain accounts. That was how they were monitoring the campaign. And they were paid to do this. And we spoke to people who'd actually received money to do it. And we found that there was, an organization in the UK that was paying people to do this. So this is something that we are seeing increasingly. We are also seeing, with the growth of fact checkers, that there are fake fact checks and fake fact checking organizations. So this is an account when Jamal Khashoggi was murdered by the Saudi government that claimed that a photo of him and his fiancée was photoshopped, which is not true. It's a real photo, but they claimed to be a fact-checking account and were spreading false claims. PolitiFact, a well-known fact-checking organization in the United States, their logo and their information was used by people to pretend that they had, given a different kind of accuracy rating to something. And so you can see, people are pretending to be a fact checker, or they're pretending to be a real fact checker and making up claims for them. Another example from Sweden, one of these is a real fact checking organization there on the bottom. And then up top is a imposter site that pretended to be them to spread false and misleading claims. One of the other things we see is that real people are often, sometimes without their knowledge, brought into these types of campaigns. And so, like, this is an example where you had workers in parts of in Ghana who were tweeting in English, tweeting about US politics, and told that they were, just kind of doing this as part of a campaign, and they didn't realize that they were actually being paid by a well-known Russian figure with ties to Vladimir Putin. And so all these people just thought they were working and, tweeting about US politics. They didn't realize that it was part of a kind of, a campaign that originated in Russia. This guy is a real lawyer in Europe. And at one point, he was asked to write an op-ed supporting one of his clients, which he did. And he wrote it. He's a real lawyer. He has real expertise in that area. But then there was a whole network of fake Twitter accounts that were used to spread what he had written. And so in this case, it's a real person, a real lawyer. He had real expertise and he wrote something real, but then inauthentic accounts spread this. And so this is where, even genuine content can be used as part of a campaign. And this was a campaign to support the Chinese technology company Huawei. All right, so almost done here. Last one is some of the technology for generating faces of people that don't actually exist is being used, of course, to conceal campaigns. So that Huawei campaign with all of these Twitter accounts, they used these photos of people that were generated by computers. So these aren't real people. They are generated by artificial intelligence, and so these accounts looked real. They looked like real people, but these were computer-generated faces used as part of the account, and we see this being used more and more. So just to conclude and to wrap up before I take some questions, we have very complex operations and campaigns, and oftentimes there is money behind it. So that increases the complexity. The growth of fact-checking has created a growth in fake fact-checkers and efforts to undermine real fact-checking. We see real people being used as part of disinformation campaigns, oftentimes without their knowledge. And we also see that there are movements of real people who are often kind of paid behind the scenes, and maybe they're spreading false, misleading content, or maybe they are supporting something. And when you look at it, they look like real people. They look like they're having real support, but there is often money behind it. And we are seeing new technologies being weaponized in order to help people cover their tracks, to conceal what they're really doing, or to create something at a much bigger scale, much faster. And at the end of the day, when it comes to the work in this area, it's still a very new field. I'm just talking about the last 10 years. This is a very new field. There are emerging practices. We still have to develop the best methodologies. And we really urgently need to address the sense of regional inequality, where political actors can get away with a lot more in places where the platforms don't pay attention and where there isn't the necessary funding and training for journalists, and where we are still struggling to get the data we need to understand truly what is happening in the digital environment, because the gatekeepers of that data, Facebook, Google, Twitter, and others, they know way more than anyone else, and they keep that close to them because in many cases it will make them look bad. And we need to find models to get access to this data, to get it equal on a global level, so that we can take this work and do an even better job of it. So with that, I would love to take some questions, and just wanted to highlight 2 resources for you. These are both free. On the left is the Verification Handbook for Disinformation and Media Manipulation. If you want to do this kind of investigative work, this is a book I edited and got contributors from around the world with lots of case studies from different parts of the world to write how-to information about how to do this. It's a free book. We don't have actually a Spanish translation yet, but if someone is interested in partnering on that, we have it in other languages. We'd be happy to. And then the final thing is on the right. This is a Google Doc that I have and maintain, where I have a list of tools and some resources for training as well, if you want to learn more about this area. So thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to get to some of your questions, and thank you again to the interpreters for putting up with me and my fast talking. I hopefully slowed down enough at times to make your work reasonably easy. So thank you very much, and would love to take some questions.
Muchas gracias Craig, por tu exposición, por tu clase, realmente una conferencia magistral. Y ahora sí abrimos el espacio a preguntas. Quiero compartir con vos algunas consultas que nos llegan desde redes sociales y desde este Zoom. Primero, hay preguntas que están referidas a cómo pueden los fact-checkers, los creíbles, los reales, mejorar dentro, digamos, aquellos que se encuentran en los países subdesarrollados, que no cuentan con recursos financieros o humanos, o sus recursos son limitados, donde las políticas de desinformación son activas y muchas veces promovidas por los gobiernos, los políticos, Facebook o otras. ¿Cómo hacemos entonces para que con esta situación limitada de carencias no lleve demasiado tiempo hacer una revisión de los casos de desinformación? Nos pregunta Bernard.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, I think one resource I would point to is the International Fact Checkers Network. which is run out of the Poynter Institute in Florida, the IFCN. They are the organization that is kind of approving and certifying fact checkers that are part of Facebook's program, but also used by other platforms. And so I think they have a lot of resources that fact checkers should be able to access, and they are eager to work with people around the world, and they do work in multiple languages. I also think the organization First Draft has a lot of great training and resources for fact checkers. So we do need to be sharing skills and information between fact checkers. I think there needs to be a lot more cooperation so that people who, as you say, are in the places with not as much funding and are battling against, perhaps better funded political operations have a chance to learn the best approaches and techniques and to apply them to where they are. The other piece of it is I would encourage fact checkers in places with fewer resources, if you are trying to get the attention of Facebook or YouTube or others, and they won't respond to you or you don't know who to contact, I think the IFCN can help, but also, you should try to contact some of the bigger fact checkers in other countries. Maybe, if you're in a Spanish-speaking country, maybe in another Spanish-speaking country where, they're larger and better funded, so that they can get you the contacts and help you get introduced to people at these platforms. So I hope that events like this bring fact checkers together. And I think we need to build our own networks and be in touch, but organizations like IFCN and First Draft, I think, can help a lot.
Siguiente grupo de preguntas están referidas al rol que van teniendo estas plataformas. Y de ahí que quieren saber, ya que mencionaste que Facebook hace grandes negocios con cuentas que diseminan desinformación, ¿qué deberíamos reclamarle a las grandes plataformas? Y esto también se junta con consultas que nos llegan por el sistema de Zoom de Víctor Miguel, que dice si esto finalmente entonces será necesario regular en una ley, ya sea una ley electoral, a fin de proteger la democracia. En síntesis, Craig, ¿qué tenemos que reclamar a las plataformas y a los gobiernos?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big question about a big issue. And right now, a lot of the laws that have been passed by governments around the world trying to address this problem, in many cases, they've been passed by authoritarian governments who are trying to criminalize independent journalism and criminalize opposition. And so I think we have to be very careful about what laws we might want to see or ask for. And so that's one part of it. And in terms of the platforms, I think where there's some potential is between the platforms and the governments in the same thing is, one of the things we need is more information from these platforms. We need more access to data, and we need to be able to investigate it independently without their influence. And so I think one path around what we need to ask of them and of governments is rules around disclosure of data, rules around transparency. If they are removing accounts and pages, particularly those related to politics in your country, Facebook should have to disclose that. And they should have to list what the pages and accounts are so that people can investigate that. And I think the only way that's going to happen is if countries and regulators start to develop some rules of what these companies need to be disclosing. They are public companies, many of them in the United States, and there are rules about the financial information they have to disclose, right? So investors can make a good decision. Well, we need a similar kind of framework around the transparency of data and the actions taken by these platforms so that us as the public can also make good decisions and there can be proper scrutiny. So I think that's one area around legislating some transparency and requirements. It's always difficult to legislate speech. So that is where there's more danger.
Excelente. Otras preguntas que nos llegan de Twitter tienen que ver si conoces estadísticas, datos que estén vinculados a medios tradicionales, es decir, a la prensa que estén envueltas en distribución de noticias falsas. Y sumo una pregunta vinculada, que es, además de los políticos o estos intereses, ¿qué otras fuentes o móviles pueden originar típicamente la desinformación? Rol de la prensa y otras fuentes. Sería la pregunta.
Yeah, thank you for that question. The interesting thing for me is, for the 10 years before I was very focused on social media and the digital environment, I was very focused on traditional media and the mistakes that traditional media makes, and on issues like plagiarism and fabrication. And so, it is absolutely true that traditional media has been a source of false and misleading information. It's absolutely true that some big media in some countries are, so committed to one political party that they will lie for that political party. They will lie for those politicians. And so the challenge we have, it's not new in that sense. We have seen it before. But what's new is that it is kind of participatory. What's new is that so many people can be a part of it now in the digital environment, and there are so many other ways to manipulate it. And so, we can't ignore traditional media in this ecosystem, because they often still have very big audiences, and they can still at times be sources of false and misleading information. Hopefully, they are behaving more responsibly. But in the digital environment, aside from the kind of political figures, who is spreading this stuff? Well, sometimes you have people who just like to kind of cause chaos. Trolls is the word we typically use in English. They may not be committed to one party. They may not care about the election. They may not vote in it or care about politics, but they like to cause trouble, and they like to mess with the media, and they like to mess with the public and politics. Typically a smaller group of people, but they exist. Who else are there? Well, on the financial and funding side of it, you can have people with a financial stake in seeing a political outcome. And maybe they are not directly linked to the political party, but they decide to step in and fund disinformation or manipulation campaigns because they have a financial interest in seeing one particular outcome. And so this is one thing to always keep in mind, which is that just because you see false content supporting one candidate or one party, that doesn't necessarily mean it's from that party. There could be other actors with other motivations who are choosing to support that particular candidate or that party. And so that's where this element of attribution of who is behind it is very important and often very difficult. Aside from that, of course, sometimes you have governments outside of a country who want to influence an election. Foreign interference. That is often one of the biggest concerns. They may be other countries or people in the region. They may be people even further away, like the United States or China, who want to have global influence. And so I think those are some of the ones that you want to pay attention to. Last one is just you have for-profit people who run websites and who want to make money from advertising, and false and misleading political content during an election can be a moneymaker. And so they will sometimes be in there as well. And all of these different actors with these different motivations, they can end up creating similar content, and it can be very hard to pull apart and see who is really behind it. And that's the work we need to do.
Sin duda es parte de los grandes desafíos que tenemos y que necesitamos entonces que haya una ciudadanía mucho más comprometida, activa con estos temas, que quiere informarse para así poder reclamar. Última pregunta, cumpliendo en tiempo y forma con la presentación. Les recuerdo que seguimos, por supuesto, con las actividades de la Cumbre en la sección de talleres, pero para despedir a Craig, hay una serie también de preguntas que nos han llegado que tiene que ver con la infodemia. ¿Qué es lo que ha pasado con la desinformación en las áreas de salud, en investigaciones, en particular con el COVID o con las vacunas a favor y en contra de coronavirus, ¿no? Que están relacionadas con el tema. A ver si nos podrías comentar algo sobre la desinformación en temas de salud, en particular en lo que respecta a COVID. Y por último también queremos saber si es posible acceder, ver cómo podemos también utilizar las herramientas que nos has mencionado, si podemos compartir el enlace a tu manual de verificación y así poder entonces poder entrenarnos un poco más en esto. Desde ya, disculpas aquellas preguntas que nos han llegado, pero se nos acaba el tiempo y tenemos que seguir con nuestra actividad. Craig, te escuchamos.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so I mean, the short answer to start is that you know, the tools and the resources that I shared absolutely can be applied to investigating health and medical mis and disinformation. You know, what we see is that some of the approaches, some of the tactics that people use in political disinformation or in other types of disinformation, it's often the same kinds of approaches, but just with different topics. And so if you understand the fundamentals of how to investigate this and how to use the tools, you can apply it to any area. I mean, and health is a huge, huge area of this. With COVID-19, I think we've all sort of realized that, but the reality with COVID-19 is that it activated existing spreaders of false and misleading health information. For them, this was a great opportunity. And so people who were already anti-vaccine, people who already mistrusted sort of Western medicine and pharmaceuticals, for them, this was the moment to get awareness and for them to become big. And, you know, one of the things I would say that is particularly powerful in health disinformation are kind of influencers. So you have, you know, people who might, you know, maybe they are a doctor, but they don't, you know, they don't support vaccines or things like that. They're alternative health professionals, and they can build up huge followings on Instagram, on Facebook, and YouTube and other places. And then also you have sort of average people, you know, someone who describes himself as, you know, I'm a mother and I'm worried about my children and I don't want to, you know, I don't want them to get a vaccine, or I don't want them to go to the hospital. And those personal narratives around health are often some of the most powerful because other mothers can relate, other parents, they can relate. And so I think when we look at health disinformation, we have to understand the importance of narrative, of kind of personal health stories in this. And we should be paying attention, not just to kind of big accounts and big people, but to the discussions taking place in groups of local mothers and local parents. And what are they talking about? And we need to do this in a way that respects privacy. But with health, it is very personal, and it can often be connected to other kinds of elements of someone's view of the world and existing fears and worries they have. And I think we saw that on a huge scale with COVID, where, you know, it was a new virus and it was very scary and people didn't know what to do for a long time. And so they would turn and listen to friends and people in their community, and they would listen to someone who presented themselves as a doctor. And so that sense of influencers and personal stories and narratives and credentials of medicine are, I think, important things to think about in the context of health disinformation. But the tactics and approaches for this kind of work, you know, can absolutely be applied to it. And I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon. I think COVID-19 has awoken and helped a lot of these kind of alternative and questionable medical and health communities and the influencers in them.
Muchas gracias, Craig. Realmente una clase magistral. Tenemos todavía muchos desafíos por delante, pero también para recalcar que también hemos logrado varios aprendizajes.